The case against domestic terrorist cell leader Marcus Thompson had captivated the nation for months, dominating news cycles and social media discussions. Thompson and his associates were accused of planning coordinated attacks on government buildings across 3 states, including the FBI headquarters in Detroit, federal courthouses in Chicago and Atlanta, and several military recruitment centers. The trial had drawn intense media attention from every major news network in the country. CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, ABC, CBS, NBC, and dozens of print journalists from The Washington Post, New York Times, and USA Today packed the gallery section, their cameras and recording equipment creating a circus atmosphere that added tremendous pressure to every decision made in the courtroom. Ahmad Hassan had arrived at the courthouse that morning at precisely 8:30 a.m., following his usual routine of arriving early to review materials one final time before testimony. He carried a briefcase filled with expert analysis documents and decades of military legal precedents that he had personally helped establish during his distinguished career. The briefcase also contained photographs from his military service, commendation letters from commanding officers, and detailed analysis of counterterrorism legal procedures that had taken him weeks to prepare specifically for this trial. At 65, his hair had turned completely gray, and his face bore the distinguished lines of someone who had seen both the horrors of war and the complexities of military justice in some of the world's most dangerous conflict zones. His eyes, still sharp and alert despite his age, reflected the intelligence and determination that had made him one of the most respected legal minds in the military. Born in Ramallah in 1959, but raised in Detroit from the age of 8 after his family fled conflict in the Middle East, Ahmad had experienced firsthand the challenges faced by Arab Americans trying to build lives in their adoptee. His decision to serve in the U.S. Army had been driven by a deep desire to prove his loyalty to the country that had given his family refuge and opportunity. After graduating summa cum laude from Harvard Law School in 1981, where he had been editor of the Harvard Law Review, Ahmad had shocked his professors and classmates by immediately enlisting in the U.S. Army rather than pursuing lucrative positions at prestigious law firms that had been courting him throughout his final year. Over 35 years of military service, Ahmad had risen through the ranks to become one of the nation's most respected military legal experts, serving tours in Iraq during both Gulf Wars, Afghanistan during the early years of Operation Enduring Freedom, Bosnia during the peacekeeping operations of the 1990s, and numerous classified operations in locations that remain secret to this day. His service record was legendary among military legal officers, and his analysis of battlefield legal situations had literally saved lives by ensuring that American forces operated within legal parameters even in the most chaotic combat situations. "Sir, I need you to stand up slowly and keep your hands visible at all times," commanded Security Officer James Mitchell, his hand resting on his weapon with practiced readiness. Mitchell had worked courthouse security for 8 years and had dealt with numerous disruptions, protests, attempted escapes, and actual security threats, but the sight of an elderly Middle Eastern man with classified documents in a terrorism trial set off every alarm in his security-trained mind. Mitchell's training had taught him to look for specific threat indicators, nervous behavior, suspicious packages, unusual interest in courthouse layout, and attempts to access restricted areas. The elderly Palestinian man's calm demeanor and obvious familiarity with legal proceedings should have suggested he belonged in the courtroom, but Mitchell's unconscious biases overrode his professional judgment. The other court security officers, Sarah Chun and David Rodriguez, positioned themselves strategically around Ahmad's table, their training kicking in automatically as they formed a containment pattern designed to prevent any potential threat from reaching the judge, jury, or gallery. Chun, a former police officer with 10 years of law enforcement experience, felt increasingly uncomfortable with the situation but followed protocol without question. Rodriguez, whose own family had immigrated from Mexico when he was a child, recognized the uncomfortable parallels between this situation and discrimination his own community faced, but remained silent in the face of his superior's orders. District Attorney Roberts approached the bench with quick, agitated steps, his voice filled with righteous indignation and barely concealed panic about the potential career implications of a security breach during such a high-profile trial. "Your Honor, This is exactly the kind of security failure that cannot be tolerated in cases involving national security. I have no idea how this individual gained access to classified materials, but his presence here represents a clear and present danger to the integrity of these proceedings and potentially to national security itself. Roberts himself was a 42-year-old rising star in the Department of Justice, known throughout Washington legal circles for his aggressive prosecution of terrorism cases and his zero-tolerance approach to courtroom security. His career trajectory had been carefully planned since his graduation from Yale Law School, with each successful prosecution building toward his ultimate goal of becoming Attorney General. His political ambitions were closely tied to his success in high-profile cases like the Thompson trial, and a security breach could derail not only this prosecution but his own future aspirations for higher office. The prosecution team, led by Roberts, had spent 2 years and millions of taxpayer dollars building their case against the Thompson cell. The investigation had involved dozens of FBI agents, NSA surveillance specialists, and international intelligence cooperation. Assistant prosecutors Jennifer Martinez and Thomas Walsh sat at the prosecution table, their faces reflecting a mixture of confusion and growing concern as they watched their carefully orchestrated trial descend into chaos over what appeared to be a simple security matter. Martinez, a Harvard Law graduate with 5 years of terrorism prosecution experience, had spent months preparing for this trial. She had interviewed hundreds of witnesses, reviewed thousands of pages of surveillance transcripts, and worked closely with intelligence agencies to build what she considered an airtight case. Walsh, meanwhile, had focused on the legal precedents and constitutional issues surrounding the evidence, ensuring that their case would withstand appeals court scrutiny. "I'm conducting a perfectly legal review of the evidence as specifically requested by this court and authorized by the Department of Defense," Ahmad said quietly, his voice carrying the calm authority of someone accustomed to tense situations and hostile environments. "Perhaps there's been some misunderstanding about my authorization to be here and my role in these proceedings." His accent, barely detectable after decades of American military service and countless briefings with high-ranking officials, still carried traces of his Palestinian origins, enough to fuel the suspicions of those predisposed to see him as a threat rather than an ally. This subtle linguistic marker had followed him throughout his career, sometimes opening doors when colleagues recognized his unique perspective on Middle Eastern conflicts and cultural nuances, but more often creating barriers he had to overcome through exceptional performance and unwavering loyalty to his adopted. Defense attorney Sarah Chun, representing the accused members of the Thompson cell, watched the unfolding drama with growing confusion and professional fascination. She had been expecting the prosecution's expert witness to arrive that morning, but the scheduled testimony had been delayed without explanation from the court clerk's office. The elderly Palestinian man's presence in the expert witness section suggested he might be connected to the case in some official capacity, but his treatment by the court seemed bizarrely hostile for someone who should have been there as part of the legal proceedings. Chun herself was a Harvard Law graduate who had built her reputation defending high-profile terrorism cases, often taking on clients that other attorneys wouldn't touch due to political considerations or personal safety concerns. Her Korean-American background had given her particular sensitivity to issues of discrimination in the justice system, and she was already calculating how this incident might affect her client's chances for a fair trial. She had seen how prejudice could infect legal proceedings, and this situation had all the hallmarks of discrimination that could provide grounds for appeal. "Misunderstanding," Roberts scoffed, his voice rising with each word as his political instincts told him to appear tough on security. "Sir, you are in possession of classified documents related to a federal terrorism case. Unless you can immediately provide proper authorization and identification, you are in violation of numerous federal statutes, including the Espionage Act, the Patriot Act, and regulations governing access to sensitive national security information." The mention of these serious federal charges sent a visible murmur through the packed gallery. Journalists began furiously typing on their phones and laptops, recognizing that they might be witnessing a major security incident unfold in real time. The potential story of a security breach during the most. Amanda Foster, a reporter for CNN who had covered terrorism cases for over a decade, immediately began live tweeting the developing situation. Her followers included thousands of legal experts, government officials, and news organizations who would amplify whatever story emerged from this courtroom. Mark Thompson from Fox News started a video livestream, while Sarah Johnson from The Washington Post began drafting what could become a front-page story about security failures in federal courts. Judge Williams, appointed to the federal bench just 3 years earlier by President Biden after a distinguished career as a prosecutor in the Southern District of New York, was known throughout the legal community for running an extremely tight courtroom. Her background prosecuting organized crime and terrorism cases had made her particularly sensitive to security concerns, especially in cases involving national security. The sight of an unauthorized individual with classified documents triggered every protocol she had been trained to follow during her extensive judicial education programs at the Federal Judicial Center. Her appointment to the bench had come after years of successful prosecution work, including several high-profile cases that had earned her national recognition. She had prosecuted mob bosses, international drug cartels, and domestic terrorists, always maintaining strict security protocols that had never been breached. The possibility that her courtroom might have experienced a security failure was both professionally embarrassing and potentially career-damaging. Bailiff Morrison, I want this individual escorted immediately to a secure location where his identity and authorization can be verified by federal security agencies, Judge Williams ordered, her voice carrying the full authority of her position and years of courtroom experience. This trial will be suspended indefinitely until we can ensure the complete integrity of our security procedures and determine. The order to suspend the trial sent shock waves through the courtroom and beyond. Months of preparation, millions of dollars in prosecution costs, extensive media coverage, and the intense public interest in seeing the Thompson cell brought to justice were all being put on hold because of what appeared to be a simple security matter. The implications extended far beyond this single trial, potentially affecting public confidence in the federal court system's ability to handle sensitive national security cases. Bailiff Thomas Morrison, a 15-year veteran of courthouse security and a former Marine who had served 2 tours in Iraq, approached Ahmad's table with obvious reluctance and growing confusion. Something about the elderly man's demeanor, his calm bearing under pressure, his obvious familiarity with legal proceedings, and the professional way he had organized his documents suggested this situation was far more complicated than it appeared. Morrison's military training had taught him to read people under stress, and nothing about Ahmad's behavior suggested he was a security threat or someone who didn't belong in the courtroom. Morrison had worked with countless military legal officers during his service in Iraq, and Ahmad's bearing reminded him of the JAG officers who had provided legal guidance during complex combat situations. The calm professionalism, the organized approach to documentation, and the unflappable demeanor under pressure were all hallmarks of experienced military legal experts. Sir, I need you to gather your materials carefully and come with me for security verification, Morrison said, though his tone lacked the aggression displayed by the others in the courtroom. His military experience had taught him that real threats rarely presented themselves so openly, and Ahmad's calm professionalism reminded him of countless military legal officers he had worked with during his own service overseas. Ahmad slowly closed the file he had been reviewing, a comprehensive analysis of legal precedents in terrorism cases that he had personally researched and compiled over several weeks of intensive preparation. The document represented hundreds of hours of work, drawing on cases from across the federal court system and international legal precedents that applied to the specific charges being brought against the Thompson cell. He looked directly at Judge Williams with the steady gaze of someone who had faced far more dangerous situations than an American courtroom, including testimony before Congress, briefings with the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and legal consultations in active war zones. Your Honor, before you make a decision that could seriously compromise this trial and create a constitutional crisis regarding due process rights, Ahmad said, his voice carrying decades of courtroom experience and legal authority, I strongly suggest you verify who has been assigned as the prosecution's expert witness in military law and counterterrorism operations for this specific case. The comment sent a visible chill through the courtroom as the implication became clear to legal observers in the gallery. Roberts's face went pale as doubt crept into his mind, and his prosecution team began frantically searching through their case files. They had indeed requested an expert witness from the Department of Defense, someone with extensive experience in military legal procedures and counterterrorism operations for exactly this type of complex case. Jennifer Martinez, the assistant prosecutor, began frantically searching through her case files with trembling hands, looking for the paperwork that would confirm the identity of their scheduled expert witness. Her stomach dropped as she found the authorization letter from the Department of Defense, detailing the credentials and expected testimony of Colonel Ahmad Hassan, U.S. Army, retired. "That's impossible," Robert stammered, his confident demeanor cracking as doubt crept into his voice and his political instincts warred with growing realization. "Our expert witness is Colonel Ahmad Hassan, one of the most decorated military legal experts in the country. He's a distinguished officer with an impeccable record. He's. The sentence hung unfinished in the air as Roberts realized what was happening. The elderly Palestinian man he had just ordered removed from the courtroom as a potential terrorist threat was the same expert witness his own office had specifically requested for this trial. The man whose testimony was supposed to be crucial to securing convictions against the Thompson cell. "Sir, I need you to gather your materials carefully and come with me for security verification," Morrison said, though his tone lacked the aggression displayed by the others in the courtroom. His military experience had taught him that real threats rarely presented themselves so openly, and Ahmad's calm professionalism reminded him of countless military legal officers he had worked with during his own service overseas. Ahmad slowly closed the file he had been reviewing, a comprehensive analysis of legal precedents in terrorism cases that he had personally researched and compiled over several weeks of intensive preparation. The document represented hundreds of hours of work, drawing on cases from across the federal court system and international legal precedents that applied to the specific charges being brought against the Thompson cell. He looked directly at Judge Williams with the steady gaze of someone who had faced far more dangerous situations than an American courtroom, including testimony before Congress, briefings with the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and legal consultations in active war zones. "Your Honor, before you make a decision that could seriously compromise this trial and create a constitutional crisis regarding due process rights," Ahmad said, his voice carrying decades of courtroom experience and legal authority, "I strongly suggest you verify who has been assigned as the prosecution's expert witness in military law and counterterrorism operations for this specific case." Thomas Walsh, the third prosecutor on the team, dropped his pen as the full implications hit him like a physical blow. They had just accused their own expert witness of terrorism, potentially compromising months of legal preparation and creating grounds for a mistrial that could free the very terrorists they were trying to convict. The irony was devastating and potentially career-ending for everyone involved. The media representatives in the gallery immediately recognized the magnitude of what was unfolding. This wasn't just a simple security incident. This was a major story about discrimination, prosecutorial misconduct, and the treatment of Arab Americans in the justice system. Phone cameras began recording, social media posts started flying, and news organizations began preparing what would become one of the biggest legal stories of the year. Judge Williams looked from Roberts to Ahmad, her confidence in the situation beginning to waver as she realized the magnitude of what might be unfolding in her courtroom. The implications for her own career, the integrity of the trial, and the broader questions about discrimination in the federal court system were becoming impossible to ignore. "Are you claiming to be Colonel Ahmad Hassan?" she asked, her voice betraying uncertainty for the first time since the incident began. Ahmad reached slowly into his jacket pocket, his movements deliberate and visible to avoid any misinterpretation by the security officers still surrounding him. He produced a military identification card, a letter of authorization from the Department of Defense, his retired military credentials, and several letters of recommendation from high-ranking military officials, documents that told the story of an extraordinary career in service to his country. The identification documents painted a picture of exceptional service. Colonel Ahmad Hassan, United States Army, retired, with security clearances at the highest levels, commendations from every conflict zone where American forces had operated in the past 3 decades, and legal expertise that had shaped military law for an entire generation of service members. "I am Colonel Ahmad Hassan, United States Army, retired," he said with quiet dignity that filled the courtroom. I was specifically requested by the prosecution to provide expert testimony regarding military legal procedures in terrorism cases, based on my 35 years of active duty service and my expertise in counterterrorism operations, military law, and international legal precedents. The silence that followed was deafening. Every person in the courtroom, from the journalists in the gallery to the court stenographer to the armed security officers, seemed to hold their breath as the full implications of what had just occurred became crystal clear. This wasn't just a case of mistaken identity. This was a moment that would define careers, change lives, and potentially reform an entire system.